Welcome to our first watering hole event of 2025. I'm Bill Brennan, and we're dedicating this work, and we are dedicated to this work of Iain McGilchrist and his hemisphere hypothesis. A few words about Illumin for those of you who don't know what Illumin is. Illumin creates communities of men, transforming men who will love greater than ourselves. We seek a life-changing spirituality, and we honor the wisdom traditions of forgiveness, radical inclusivity, and we carry on the work started by Father Richard Rohr. Our primary concern is inner work that expands the depth and breadth of love in ourselves and makes a difference in the world. We seek to form future generations of men who will restore these practices. We aim to serve this world and build a world that celebrates the beauty of all things. I give you my brother, Anthony Monticchio. Tony?
Yeah, thanks, Bill. I guess we have the all set to go. Chris, do you want to put the
Yes,
spotlights on if they're not? And Ian.
we're good.
Okay. We always like to start our gatherings with a candle. If I can get it lit. Okay. It's called the Living Flame of Love. And we always start with gratitude, joy, and hope. Gratitude for all the men and women that have led us to be here today on this path. Joy for all the people in the world trying to make the world a better place by learning of Ian's work with our right hemisphere, and the joy of the people that are here right now today that's decided to be together. And hope for all the future generations, in our case, young boys and men that'll restore these practices. We'll talk about that in a little bit. So thanks, Ian, for being with us. And as a way to get started to
Pleasure.
greet each other, could everybody just put where they're signing in from in the chat? That would be nice. It's the first time we're actually using this time slot, which might work out better for us. It actually covers a lot of time zones, and I'm getting the feeling like we have a lot of participation across the world. One of the beauties about technology is we can gather like this and not have a strain on the culture, on the system, in nature, so to speak. But we can gather to learn together. Uh, Ian, I was one day in the UK on a business trip, and I worked in an office downtown London. And one of the delights was I always heard about a ritual after the workday is done. Everybody retires to a pub down the street. They have a drink, and then they go home. And I always heard that, and I got to experience it firsthand. And it was a delight. It really was. It was a beautiful transition. And I know you're not in the UK, in London at least, but I know it's this time of the day for you. And I want to appreciate the fact that you took the time late in the day at the end of the week to be with us. Um, Stephen Jenkinson taught us recently that the culture's bereft of elders. There's just not that many elders in the culture today. And what his advice to us was, when you're in the presence of someone who is an elder, and in our case, we would use Robert Moore's words about king energy. And if you're in the presence of someone who's a king to you, and the king does two things, he brings order and he gives blessing. And in a way, I see in you the books that you've offered the world as making some order out of the chaos. And the blessing that you're giving us right here is taking your time to be present for different communities, in this case, Illumin. So I want to say, and I know there's a lot of men in Illumin that see that energy in you, and I want to acknowledge it. I often like to start with why. So why did this event come to be? Ian, when I started listening to what you were saying, it occurred to me Illumin is a right brain oriented community of men wanting to be more right brain focused. When asked, I say we trace our lineage back to St. Francis through Father Richards as a Franciscan friar, and through Carl Jung, as a psychologist through Robert Moore. Richard often says that spirituality is more a verb than a noun. And the first chapter that pulled at me when I was looking at your book, I was just flipping through the chapters. There's a lot of them, there's 28. And I picked the movement one. Out of all of them, I liked the titles, and I said, which one would I pick as a starting point? And I picked the movement one. And it reminded me of what Richard always tells us. And Jim Burns is here today. We used to say in our opening, Illumin is a community. And we changed that one word to say Illumin creates communities of men. And it feels like the spirit of what you were trying to say in that chapter, that it's this movement and flow more than a static thing. The other thing that came to mind when you used the word hypothesis, you talk about hemisphere hypothesis. Richard, I see him, he offered a similar hypothesis. And when he went out into the world, he saw what was missing was the loss of transformative process. In this case, male initiation rite. In the UK, they call it the rites. In America, in the States, we call it the men's rite of passage. Same process. And Richard brought that back, and he wants to restore that. And Illumin is now the keeper of that transformative process. So when we heard that you accepted the invitation through Mary, everybody was very excited to know that you'd be with us today. And they asked, the first question was, how did you get Iain? And I said, well, you know, the Spirit works in mysterious ways, and I still feel that way. And then when the second time I got asked the question, I said, you know, I had the courage to ask. And sometimes it just really takes the courage of one person to take some action. And I just wanted to say that. And when we get into it a little bit, I know you shared a story about chapter 28, which is the one I wanted to start with. It's the last chapter, it's called The Sense of the Sacred, since it seems to align very nicely to what Illumin's mission and vision is. And it seems like you had to take some courage to bring that chapter out into the world. So maybe you can share the story with us in a little bit. Another thing I wanted to say is we close our year in December with Thomas Merton. And when the Pope came to America, which is actually 10 years ago today, there were 4 Americans that he told Americans to follow. Thomas Merton, this weekend, Martin Luther King is the second one, and Abraham Lincoln and Dorothy Day. So we're going to close today with Martin Luther King. But we had a watering hole last month on dreaming. And what I liked about the presenter was they said what they liked about dream work was it was common across everybody, regardless of gender, race, age, social status. Everybody 2 hours a night dreams, whether they know it or not. The brain fires back up after its restorative time, and it tries to process things unconsciously through dreams. What I like about what you're offering us, another common denominator, we all are born with 2 hemispheres. There's no sense arguing about that. We can agree that we have 2 hemispheres and then start moving forward. And I feel like you've given us this level playing field to start this work together with. Thich Nhat Hanh said the next Buddha won't be an individual, he'll be a community. And I feel like it's nice to see Channel McGilchrist now coming together with Illumin. So I'm grateful for that. So our format for tonight will be similar to other watering holes. We'll start with ritual. A lot of what you say in The Matter with Things has to do with values. And we value the process of ritual highly in Illumin. It's a cornerstone that we use as a technique to connect these messages in the words you're going to say. It'll be a small ritual to start us off. It'll ground us in our body. We also use the sense of sight through images. I found a sculpture called The Release of Deception. It took the artist 7 years, you'll find out, to make it. It's a man that has a fishing net on him. And there's a part of your book that we'll read when we look at that image. After the ritual's over, then we'll have a set of prompts that we will invite you to share your wisdom with us on. And depending on time, I know there's probably going to be questions from the audience. We'll leave about 20 or so minutes for questions from those gathered here today. I have a resource page for anyone who wants to follow up with Iain and the work that he's doing and Illumin. We'll go through that at the end. And then we'll close with Martin Luther King. It's a segment from his book, Strength to Love. And I'll explain that more when we get to the end. And music, Iain always likes to talk about music. And so I thought, what could I give him as a parting gift for his time with us? and I wanted to include music. So I found a Gregorian chant. I always like Gregorian chants. It feels very heavenly when I hear it. And it's a chant called Sanctus. We'll explain that more when we get there. So we may go over a few minutes. I hope that's okay with everybody. If you do want to stay at the end of the evening, at the event, there's an after chat for about 15 minutes. We're going to be in small groups, 3 or 4, and there'll be some prompts for you to meet somebody with and talk about what you heard Iain say today. So Iain, this event started during COVID as a way to keep our community together when in-person events were no longer allowed. And we decided to have this event in June. June in the States is Father's Day. May is Mother's Month. June is Father's Month. And that first event, the prompt was, and we've continued it ever since, is to help us get to know you a little bit. Can you look back into your childhood and tell us maybe a brief story about a father figure in your life? Could be your father, grandfather, uncle, or a male mentor that had some that was elemental in your life at that stage of your life. I know you mentioned getting involved maybe with a monastery, and you mentioned a brother that you have in chapter 28. I just open up to you to share with us a little bit of your early childhood. And thank you.
But that's after the ritual.
That's now, and then we'll do the ritual.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, interesting what you say about June. I was born in June. My father was born in June, and my parents married in June. In fact, I was born the day before they were married, but 3 years later. There are 3 people who immediately come to mind, and one, of course, is my father, who was an unusual man. He was a kind man, he was a good man, and he was a general practitioner, and I think was very much liked by his patients. But he was also somewhat on the spectrum, as we would now say. We didn't have that way of talking then, but looking back, he was. He didn't really understand quite a lot of the things that have mattered enormously to me, like religion itself, poetry and music and these other things. But there were 2 people who instead were very important to me. One was my maternal grandfather, who I loved very much, and he was very fond of me, and he'd had 2 daughters himself, and I think he was delighted to have a son, and he wanted to introduce me to the wonderful things in science that he knew about. He was a chemist, not a pharmacist, but an academic chemist, and he had a workshop in which he would enthrall me with extraordinary things that he could do with simple tools and a Bunsen burner and all the rest. And so I got to love this. And he also had lived in Japan before the First World War and used to enthrall me with the stories of Japan. And we would do things together. Whenever I went to stay with him, we made a bird bath together from scratch, I remember. And when he was doing things in the garden, he would involve me in them. My father was actually rather busy most of the time. My grandfather was retired, so it was actually easier for him to have that relationship. But probably the most important man for me was my housemaster at school. I went to Winchester, which is a medieval foundation, 14th century, one of the oldest schools in the country, and started, of course, as a religious foundation. In fact, it was founded by William of Wykeham, who was the Archbishop of Canterbury in the 14th century, and thus the most powerful man in England after the king. And he wanted it to be a training place for what he called poor scholars. He himself came from a humble background. There's a misconception these days that nobody from a humble background would have got anywhere in the past. It's only now that they will. I think actually there's something almost the opposite about it, since we put obstacles in the way of people from poor backgrounds achieving excellence anymore. We're so worried. However, there he did. He had this foundation. I ended up being there. And it was a boarding school, though my parents were in the same town, so I saw them fairly often. But he really modeled something very important for me. He was an enormous man, looked rather like a medieval friar. He was about 6'3" and sort of comparably round. And he had very bright blue eyes, and he was always twinkling mischievously, and he laughed a great deal. And he had a way of both being deeply sympathetic to whatever you were talking about, and yet setting it in a slightly comical perspective, just with a choice of words, which enabled one to take things more lightly. And I loved this. And he also realized that I loved religion. My parents weren't at all religious, so it was a new experience for me, and that I was interested in psychology. And so he lent me at the age of about 14 or 15 his copy, which I think was a first edition of William James's The Varieties of Religious Experience. And he used to say, I'm going to take he had a dog called Sheba. He said, I'm taking Sheba for a walk in. Do you want to come with me? And we'd go off over the downs together. And we'd begin declaiming poetry to one another. John Donne, George Herbert, but also John Clare. And I remember these times with great affection. And he taught me something very important about he was a man who knew very good boundaries, but he was also extremely kind and very funny.
That was beautiful, Ian. Thank you for bringing those three men into the circle with us. And I can see you had a rich start with male energy, and that seems to make sense to me now. So thank you, Ian, for sharing a little bit about your early development, your early childhood, the men that were in your life helping you become a man yourself and a good king. So now we'll do the ritual. Why ritual? I'll start with for Ian to share his thoughts on. Ian, by the way, I told my wife when the book came in, hearing you talk about hemispheres, the book came wrapped in clear wrap. And when I first saw it, before I opened it, I said, it looks like a brain. There's like these two, there's these two parts to it that look like a brain to me. So I don't know if that was intentional, but that was certainly hit home when I saw it and I felt it. If I would, so we said chapter 28 is where we'll start. I feel like it's the one chapter that really does align with Illumin's mission and vision, the sense of the sacred. I like that you use the word sense. It feels like we all have this sixth sense, this innate quality, just like all our other senses that we're born with. If I could subtitle it, this quote I like is, love begins where intellect ends. And I feel like that's the beginning of chapter 28. So could you tell us a little story of how that chapter came to be, and if there was some resistance to maybe including it?
Well, I don't think I mentioned God, or if I do, perhaps only once or twice, in The Master and His Emissary. But I thought that for those who had eyes to see, it was really a sort of work of cryptotheology. And I was delighted and astonished to learn that Rowan Williams, who I'm sure you know, was the Archbishop of Canterbury and a prominent theologian, I mean, one of the most interesting theological minds alive, apparently got into a train in Oxford with some friends and talked all the way to London about this book. And then they were picked up in a car for the Archbishop and his friends. They went to Lambeth Palace and they sat for 20 minutes in the car talking about it. Now, that book didn't even sort of overtly say anything about God, but I think that my whole way of looking at the world that I was trying to explain has room in it, not only room in it, but sort of cries out for an understanding of things that are ruled out by the way in which we are taught to think nowadays. So the first thing I should say is that I'm a great believer in science and reason. I've devoted most of my life to them. And people say to me sometimes about my writing, well, it's really quite left hemisphere in the sense it's got a lot of science and reason in it. Well, the first thing to say is that the right hemisphere contributes to science and reason just as much as the left. And also that it, I don't dislike these things. I think they're very important. My only point is that they have limitations. And that image of the net that is cast over one's psyche, which is what Schelling was referring to in that passage that you referred to, caught in the nets of reason. Nothing wrong with reason. It's just that it cannot answer the big questions. It can take us only so far on the basis of the premises that it adopts. And it adopts, and very reasonably, science rules out investigating purpose or value. But what it can't do at the end of that is say there are no purposes and there are no values, because it ruled them out from the start. It's not competent to talk about them. So I thought it was a pretty important topic. And when I came to write The Matter with Things, which amusingly enough started out as going to be a much shorter version of The Master and His Hemisphere, I thought that when I started to do this, I had a contract with Penguin Random House to do this, but when I started doing it, I thought, well, there's nothing in this for me. I want to explore the meaning for us in our lives, in everything in life, really, of the fact that we have these two distinct hemispheres. And I know you're going to ask me later to talk about what the differences are, so it may not make much sense to plough in first on what happened about that chapter, but I'll do my best. So I knew that what I wanted to ask was, how do we know anything? It's a pretty important point. And it takes a long work to answer it. And that work is in three parts. The first part is, how do we gather any data about the world at all? How do we know anything on which we can base reason or science or imagination or intuition? How do we get our first take on the world? And I looked at attention, perception, judgment, i.e. the things we think about on the basis of what we've attended to and what we've perceived. Intelligence, both cognitive and emotional and social intelligence, and creativity, in which we see how to fit these things together. And what I pointed out was that the right hemisphere is better than the left at all of these. It is more gifted. It is going to be more reliable. And this is the opposite of the bad old story that was told about the hemispheres, where the left was a little bit boring, but at least it was down to earth and reliable, whereas the right hemisphere was perhaps imaginative, but a bit given to flights of fancy. This is completely wrong. The right hemisphere is our tether to reality. It is imaginative, yes, but imagination is the opposite in many ways of fantasy, something I may talk about later. So that was the first part of the book. And the second part was, and I think that's important, because when you look at philosophy, in the past, people often said, well, some people say this and some people say that, but you just have to go, well, take your pick. I don't think we any longer need to take our pick, because I have explained at great length that the right hemisphere is far more reliable. If we rely on the data, on the picture that we get from the right hemisphere, we will not be caught out, if you like, by reality in the way that we would if we were governed by the left hemisphere. So that's an important step forward in philosophy. And then the second part of the book, which is also in the first volume, was about the paths that we can follow. And I thought those were science and reason, but also intuition and imagination. And they're every bit as important, if not more important. All of these ways are important. They should all be exercised where appropriate. And at the moment, we only tend to use one or two, science or reason. And imagination and intuition get a bad rap. And this is wrong, and I explained at length why it is wrong and why they are absolutely essential for any kind of understanding. And then the last part of the book is, so given what we now know, that there are these four ways of approaching things, and there are these two hemispheres, and we can recognize the imprint, the hallmark of their thinking when we see a certain kind of theory, what should we conclude about the cosmos in
We just lost sound.
Yeah, so did we.
on the nature of time,
Yeah, you just
on the nature of motion and flow, which I think was the one you were talking about, on space and matter, matter and consciousness, and on values and purpose. And finally, the sense of the sacred. And what I wanted to do was to lead people by the hand through these stages, which are all rigorously argued. And I might say to them, well, do you agree with it? Yeah, yeah, that's true. Yes, okay. And then finally, without them, as it were, anticipating it, I would have a long chapter on the sacred. And I would hope that anyone who had started this journey thinking that only somebody who was very simple-minded or ill-educated would believe in something like the sacred, to come to a point of view where only somebody who was a bit simple-minded or ill-educated would dismiss it. I don't say they would necessarily embrace it, but they really ought to be open to it. And I tried then in that chapter to say what I felt was the nature of whatever you like to call it, the holy, the sacred, the divine. And I was strongly advised by a number of philosophers who read the text not to include that chapter, because they said, look, you've done a very good job so far of explaining philosophically why we should think in certain ways. But when you bring in this matter of the sacred, what are we to think of you? You will be dismissed as a faith head. And interestingly, I haven't had much of that reaction, in fact. The most I've had is certain very conventional, probably rather fundamentalist Christians who have taken me to task for not being more explicit about Christianity. I didn't want to be too explicit. Anyone who reads it and has an imagination can see exactly where I'm going with this. And I do talk about Christian mystics and so on. But I didn't want anyone who had a different kind of religious approach. It might be a Hindu or a Taoist or whatever it was. I didn't want them to feel excluded or put off.
Yeah, that was beautiful. Beautiful, Ian. I was thinking you could be a lawyer. You know, the way you present your case in that book, it's almost like a lawyer. You do it so precisely. It's beautiful.
You remind me of my mother, who used to say, "Oh God, you should be a barrister." That's what we call, an attorney in court. Yes, yes.
That's funny. Yes. All right. So I thought where would we go next? Because I know I'm watching the clock. I was going to have you explain the right, left, right, but I think what's maybe more important now is to put your two hypotheses. And I know you said Richard reached out to you, so that was beautiful to hear. And when you were doing the
Sorry
master,
about that.
that's all right. It's the master and his emissary. Ian was telling us
Sorry,
earlier
sorry.
yeah, that's okay.
I forgot to switch Zoom off.
Okay. You okay now, Ian?
I thought we might be invaded by my cats, but I didn't anticipate being invaded by one of my daughters. But there we are.
Okay. Can you hear me? Okay.
I can, yes. Please carry on where we were.
Yes. Okay. No, I guess what I wanted to do next was just put together what I see as a lock and a key. I see your hemisphere hypothesis as the lock, and I see Richard's hypothesis of the loss of transformative process as the key. And what's interesting, it's the first quote that you use in The Matter with Things. This idea, this metaphor of a lock and a key that the master forged, and no one ever picks up the key. So I just wanted to use, I know you use.
Worth saying that's a quote from Wittgenstein.
Okay, yes, thank you. I know you quote Mircea Eliade's work in your Matter with Things. And the book that we're going to use here is The Rites and Symbols of Initiation, the Myths of Birth and Rebirth. So I'm just going to read a little piece of it. And I wanted to get your thoughts on this transformative process and maybe where in the brain this liminal process takes place. He says, there may be no time more suited to the study of rites of passage than the threshold between the end of modernity and an uncertain future of humanity. He goes on to say that initiation means beginning the revelation of one's true self. It includes the opening up of the inner life of the spirit and releasing the potentials and possibilities within the individual. Eliade says the meaning is always religious and spiritual. When rites of passage disappear from conscious presentation, they nonetheless appear in unconscious and semi-conscious guises. They surface as misguided and misinformed attempts to change one's own life. They become miscarriages of meaning, tragic acts or empty forms in ghostly shapes. They surface in dreams, alchemy, literature, and therapy. Without them, life flattens out. The purpose of initiation is to produce a decisive alteration in the religious, spiritual, and social status of the person to be initiated. In philosophical terms, initiation is equivalent to a basic change in existential condition. The novice emerges from the ordeal endowed with a totally different being from that which he possessed before initiation. He has become another. Iain, can you share with us your perspective on this lost transformative process of initiation? This feels like a type of Gestalt experience for a person that is necessary for positive change to take hold in a person's life. Where in the brain would these liminal experiences take place?
Oh gosh, there's so much that, as there is in everything, that we just don't have time. I feel very up against time, but never mind. Yes, I think. Well, clearly, what we're talking about here, when we talk about a rite or a ritual, is something that is an embodied experience that has a metaphorical nature. In fact, I call rites and rituals embodied metaphors, so that they express something to us at a level that is implicit. And since we're talking about hemispheres, the right hemisphere is far better at understanding implicit meaning. The left hemisphere takes everything literally, and the right hemisphere is much more in touch with the body. So these embodied experiences that are rituals are very important to us. And I have experienced rituals in my life that have moved me extremely deeply. I also think that, although I'm not recommending that everybody starts, there's a lot to be said both for and against boys going to boarding schools. But actually, one of the things that happened to me was I fortunately went to a very delightful, beautiful and happy school, but there was a sense in which I was taken away from the immediacy of the family circle at 12 or 13, and alongside a lot of boys and men, because in those days the school was just for boys. And one learnt a completely different way of being for a while. Now, I mean, you can argue about the worth of that, but all I'm really saying is that I suppose that most people don't have that. And what happens is that they form groups or gangs, but without that oversight or the wisdom of the elders that you talked about. All these rituals in the past were presided over by elders, in which they induced, or not induced, but inducted the young into ways of thinking and ways of being, and skills, practical skills of how to hunt, how to gather, how to do whatever it was they were doing together. And there isn't in gangs, and it's almost like there's an intuition we should be all getting together and doing something, but there's no longer any culture to help them. There's no longer anybody wise to oversee it, and so you get gangs of marauding young who are basically wild and I mean, it's not good for them and it's not good for us, and it doesn't help them become responsible adults. I think a very old-fashioned thing to say, and probably not a kind of politically astute thing to say these days, but I think that actually if men had to do a year or two of military service with other men, I think that would give them a sense of responsibility, of duty, of fidelity, of the importance of trusting and of being trustable, trustworthy. And these are things that we've rather lost sight of. I think one of the problems with growing up nowadays is absent parents, often two of them working. So you don't have what I had, which was my mother at home and keeping things together. And again, there are all sorts of reasons why we might not want to go back to that. But the fact of having somebody there who is, in, as it were, the centre of a family is incredibly important, actually. And it's not less important than being sort of CEO of Goldman Sachs. It may be very much more important, and is, in my view. So there's all these things that need to be taken into account. But I think that what you're asking about here is ritual, and that was Eliade's, area of particular expertise and interest. And these have been taken out of life and taken out with the loss of a religious tradition or a tradition at all. Because when you say, that they're initiated into something, it's something that goes backwards and forwards in time. They are in touch with those who came before them. And, in most societies that are not like our own, deracinated, uprooted from where we lived in the midst of nature, in those societies, they can hear the voices of the elders. I mean, we think that's just a metaphor, but I'm not sure that it is. How do we know that they don't really hear messages? I think they do. And I think if you don't believe you can do this, you don't exercise the faculty, and the faculty atrophies, and you can no longer hear those things. So I believe we have closed, as Blake said in the 18th century, we closed ourselves in those nets of rationalism. And once again, I'm not an anti-rationalist. I think reason is very important, but I do think that there are things that go beyond it. Music, for example, is not irrational. It is supra-rational. It is beyond reason. Reason simply can't have anything to say about it. And so that's the way I would look at it. I think that's what's gone missing from our world.
Yeah, beautiful. Beautiful, Ian. Thanks for your sharing. Um, yes, like you say, we could spend all night for sure. I just wanted to mention as we close this prompt, restoring these transformative initiatory processes requires a community to hold the space for the individual prior to,
Absolutely.
during, and after the experience. And Illumin endeavors to be that community in the world. So I just wanted to mention that. And I know,
Yes,
Ian,
sure.
you said that for the next area, we'll go back to the master and his emissary. So back to the
Okay.
basics, so to speak. And there's this book. It's called The Everlasting Stream. I know in that chapter you talk about the stream of consciousness and where that word stream came from as more of a flow than a static thing. And interestingly enough, this book is titled The Everlasting Stream. And it's passed around through Illumin, through men. And it's Walt Harrington is the author. He was scheduled to write George W. Bush's memoir. It would have meant he had to stay with him for 8 years and then to write the book. He was a award-winning author for the Washington Post. He doesn't get that assignment, but what he does with his time is he's in an interracial marriage, and he spends the time getting to know his wife's family, his father-in-law, and his father-in-law's friends. It's a long setup to say this book's about rabbit hunting and the friendship that the men have when they hunt the rabbits. Walt himself never hunted. He was a city man, and his son never hunted, but he becomes a hunter and his son. So I just wanted to read this one little piece, and then that maybe you can explain to us these two different fields of awareness. So it goes on to say, these little creatures are pretty remarkable. They go back 55 million years, native to Asia, Africa, Europe, and North America. The ancient Greeks hunted them. Animals, too, feast on them. Celebrated environmentalist Aldo Leopold called them meat from God. Before hunting starts in the fall, 3/4 of all rabbits that year are dead. To ensure the bounty, nature made rabbits into reproductive marvels. A doe can bear up to seven litters of 7 babies a year. In 90 days, the babies can bear babies of their own. The advice that his father-in-law's friend Carl gave to him was this on hunting, and it seemed contradictory. Carl said to him, Walt, stay relaxed and alert at once. Stay relaxed
Absolutely.
and alert at once. Relaxed enough to see the sweep of the foliage for flashes of movement within your field of vision. Alert enough to see the foliage intently square foot by square foot. But remember that a man who relaxes too much will miss the motionless rabbit blending into the brush. A man who looks with too sharp a focus, too narrow a focus, will miss the flash of white tail at the edge of his vision. So, Ian, when I heard you talk about these two fields of awareness, that page on that book came right back to me because I remembered him talking about these two, as a hunter, these two fields of awareness you have. And I know you talk a lot about the left having to grab its prey and the right having to make sure it doesn't get eaten. And I thought maybe that could open up this prompt to just explain some of the basics of these two ways that we see the world and some of the differences in between them.
Okay, yes, yes. At the risk of using up more time, but I think it's terribly interesting about hunting that when I have a passage in the Master's Empty about hunting, and what this is Western trackers who worked with African tribes hunting and learned their techniques. What the hunter said was that you have to feel your way into the animal that you are hunting so that you become that animal, to be able to predict where it is going to go. Yet, so there is a one-mindedness of you with the thing that you're hunting. There's a very special kind of activity. And I also thought when you said relaxed and alert, how this is almost like how one should be when meditating, that one is not going to sleep, but one is relaxed. And that indeed relaxation and alertness are in the matter with things. I talk about the TT races in the Isle of Man, this completely most dangerous sporting event in the world, in which people race over a 62-mile track of just ordinary roads on the island and reach speeds of up to 200 miles an hour. These are not curated tracks. They have potholes and drain covers and sharp bends and roads. And the thing that these people describe, there's quite a lot on their mentality, is that they're completely relaxed. And yet they take in absolutely everything, are aware of just a wisp of smoke in the periphery of their vision. And they're not even looking at where they are now. They're looking at something that is like a mile ahead down the track. I just thought I'd say that. And if people are interested, please, pick that up in The Matter With, it's in The Matter With Things, my more recent book. But yes, the Navajo have two words for attention: hard eyes and soft eyes. And hard eyes are the ones that you use when you're tracking an animal. And the soft eyes are the ones where you appreciate the landscape. So why do we have two hemispheres at all? It seems a very counterintuitive thing, since the brain has power proportionate to the number of connections it's make. So putting a whopping great divide right down the middle of it seems like a very odd thing for evolution to have done. The reason is that in order to survive, all creatures have to be able to pay attention to the world in two different ways at the same time. And this is because in order to survive, they need to get stuff, basically to eat, but also to pick up a twig to build a nest, or to chase an animal and catch it, whatever it is. They need to have a predatory attitude towards what they see. I need that, I'm going to get it. But if that's the only kind of attention they have, this very narrowly targeted attention, they will not last. They'll be toast very quickly because they won't see the predator. They won't see their mates, their conspecifics. They need to be looking out for a lot of things at the same time. And so this requires the brain to have two ways of attending. One is narrowly targeted to a detail that you already know and you already think is important for you, in order to grab it quickly. And the other is a kind of general openness without preconception to everything else that's going on, a sustained, open vigilance. And not surprisingly, these types of attention produce different kinds of worlds. I mean, when I first realized that this was the important difference between the two hemispheres, I didn't immediately realize how significant that is, because the way we attend to the world changes what it is we find there. If you attend with a certain kind of preoccupation and a certain kind of detachment, you will find a very different kind of world there from one in which you enter into what it is you're seeing and understand it in a fuller sense. So what does this, this is really an elevator pitch. So what does this mean for these two kinds of world? It means that to the left hemisphere, the world is made up of bits, things that are atomistic, separate from context, already desired, isolated, static, and easy to grab. And those things are, they declare what they are, otherwise you wouldn't be attending to them with the left hemisphere. So it's very clear what it is, it's clear what you're doing, and it's broken up. It's abstract, it's not seeing the actual thing, it's seeing the type of thing. It's seeing, oh, that's one of those kinds of birds. I'm going to go and I'm going to catch that one, rather than seeing the actual bird in the fullness of its being. Meanwhile, to the right hemisphere, it's quite different. So instead of there being lots of separate things that are very clear, there are lots of things that are not isolable because they are effectively connected to ultimately everything else. So things are connected. They are also never static. They are always in flow. They are always in a context, and the context changes radically what is meant by something. They are embodied, and that embodiment is sheared off completely by the left hemisphere. Anything to do with emotion and the body is very poorly understood by the left hemisphere. But the right hemisphere sees that here are contextually determined and reciprocally determining their context, entities that are living and indeed animate. Is one of the differences. The right hemisphere sees a world made up of animate entities, the left as largely inanimate entities, even if they are things that we would say are alive. So these are quite different worlds. You've got one which is a bureaucrat's dream in the left hemisphere. Everything's clear. There are little pathways that connect everything. There are rules for how you do everything. There's no such thing as an individual, only categories which are abstract, and it gives you power to control. Whereas in the right hemisphere, we see what actually is, which is nothing like the bureaucrat's dream, and is in fact a bureaucrat's nightmare, in which nothing is fully determined. I mean, we know what things are, but they can't be ever completely, certainly pinned down, that they are always connected to other things, they're changing, they are implicit in their nature, so that we have to understand the bits that are not explicit, that are not on the surface. And that's true of poetry, it's true of music, it's true of art, it's true of ritual, it's true of narrative, of myth, of religion, of all the things like love and sex that matter to us. That there's a load that is implicit, and if we just get the explicit, we've utterly changed its nature and really not understood it. So that is this other world, which is a living world. And one way of putting it is that the left hemisphere's world is a representation, whereas the right hemisphere's world is a presence. So the things present to us, they come into being for us as we give them right hemisphere attention. Whereas in the left hemisphere, they get switched over very quickly from the right hemisphere, which is the first one to take notice of the whole. And it said, and then it's from that the left hemisphere goes, oh, food, I'm going to go and get that. But the first take is the right hemisphere's take. Then it goes to the left hemisphere where it's turned into categories, it's systematized, it's abstracted. And then that information, which is useful, is fed back to the right hemisphere if all is working well. And the right hemisphere now sees it as a whole. And I sometimes say, because it's a useful little image, it's like learning a piece of music. Originally, you're attracted to the whole piece in the right hemisphere, which understands music better than the left. Then, when you begin to play it, you have to break it up into passages, so you have to practice the fingering and all that, and you understand the harmonics, so you get to reflect on it. But when you go back to play the piece in a performance, you must forget all that left hemisphere stuff. But it wasn't a waste. It was very important, but it only gets to be useful if it's then under the radar, if you like, it's no longer where the whole is seen. So first you get a picture of the whole, then you break it up into parts, and finally you go back to the whole, which is now enriched by this process of going from right to left to right.
Yeah. Yes, thank you, Ian. That was beautiful. And I'm watching the time. It's just about 1 o'clock. We have about 30 minutes left, and I know there'll be some questions from those gathered here today. So I'm trying to think which one I want to end on before I lose my So I'm trying to think. Maybe I know you mentioned the paradox and the whole a little bit. So maybe there's one we didn't talk a little bit about, but when I told a young man about your work at work, he immediately told me when we were talking about the corpus callosum, he says, "Oh, that's what drug therapy does." What he said to me was, it sounds like what drug therapy tries to do is, because you said it was an inhibitory function. It filters out what the other side can see, and what he thought said was it's the drug that actually releases the two hemispheres from seeing more information about each other. At least that's what his intuition was telling him. So I remember Carl Jung said there's no when he talked about psychedelics, his quote was, "There's no unearned wisdom." That the psychedelics, you still have to earn the wisdom. And I feel that's true to me. I haven't done a lot with psychedelics personally, but I'm hearing it's becoming more in the culture of
Yeah.
acceptance that there's a drug induced state that puts the mind in some kind of an awareness that if you have an elder or good guide that can help you make sense of the experience with the drug, that could be illuminating for you. Um, do you want to offer any thoughts about the idea of putting our mind into some drug-induced state uh, to help us, to see things in a bigger whole? I don't know.
Yes, I mean, first of all, I'd like to say that I don't endorse that nice idea about what the corpus callosum is. It's a much more complicated story than that. Um, and obviously today is not the kind of occasion when I can explain what the corpus callosum is really important for. But when it comes to drugs, I myself fairly skeptical, but I'm not saying that people don't have life-altering experiences, and I'm not saying those experiences are never of deep value. I know the accounts of people for whom this has been very important. I think, though, that we don't know quite what it is that is happening when we take mind-altering drugs. And by the way, they don't all work the same way. So that some, such as mescaline, for example, would appear to favor the left hemisphere over the right. And I'm not sure that we know enough about. I mean, I've had a discussion with another neuroscientist about this over correspondence lately. But I mean, again, I haven't got time to explain this, but back in the 60s, there was a very interesting experiment in which people who had epilepsy had parts of either their right or left temporal lobe removed. And it's interesting that it was the ones who had the left hemisphere temporal lobe intact seemed to get the hallucinations and experiences, not those with the right relatively intact. It's a complex story. There isn't one answer to it, but it certainly doesn't seem to be. I'm not willing to say it's to do with the hemispheres. It certainly seems to be to do with removing the filtering process of the frontal lobes. And without the filtering process of the frontal lobes, we would be much less intelligent and insightful creatures than we are. The great apes and humans are those who have developed the frontal lobes, and the frontal lobes enable one, interestingly, again by inhibition, to stand back from experience and see it in a broader context. And what I think happens when one takes certain kinds of mind-altering drugs is that the frontal lobes lose this inhibitory activity, function. And that is exciting because all kinds of things flood into the mind. It's like being suddenly flooded with stimuli. And although that's fine, I'm not sure that it's a path to wisdom. And I'd also like to say that at least 50% of the time people have horrible experiences that frighten them so much that they never want to take drugs again. So it's certainly not a piece of cake. It is not a path necessarily to wisdom. As I say, I'm not denying for some people this seems to have been so, but I think that there's a cynical move by pharmaceutical companies to promote the idea of drug taking of this kind as a way to insight. And I think it's because they will be able to market them without having to have done any research. Yeah. And it's a bonanza. And I think it's wholly irresponsible. So I think under certain circumstances, under the guidance of people who have much experience then maybe taking mind-altering drugs can be more than just either entertaining or horrifying. It might even give one insight. But I think there are other paths to insight I would like to mention, such as meditation, such as being alone in nature, such as praying, such as listening to music, reading poetry, great art, religious ceremonies, and these things are much, much safer and more likely to take you to profound places, in my humble experience.
Yes, yes. Thank you, Ian. And I know that was a controversial prompt to add, but I loved everything you said, and it feels my intuition is true too, that we can do it without the need of the drug. I firmly believe that, with the help of good elders. So thank you for offering that. So I'm just being mindful of the time. We have a few minutes before we close, and I know I'm sure there's some questions from the men and women that are
Sure.
gathered here. I don't think we'll get to all of them. But I would say if you do have a question, put it in the chat or you can raise your hand and we can spotlight you. Let's see. Does anybody have a question that's here? Or is there something in the, I see. Okay, we'll start with Dave Stoney, right? I'll just take them on the order that they're spotlight here.
Right. Thank you. Thank you very much. And Ian, very nice to see you
Again.
again. Yes, indeed. And I had a question about neural representations, Ian, and it's neural representations seem to be commonly implied explicitly or implicitly in much of modern cognitive neuroscience. And their presumption is that certain neurons seem to have their own sentience, and that groups of these neurons working together provide for our perception of the world, which in fact then turns out to be a hallucination, and so forth. So I just wondered about your thoughts about neural representations.
Yes. I'm against any too simple-minded attempt to map specific neural representations onto certain experiences. And I'm, of course, particularly concerned by a temptation which seems to be rarely resisted by many neuroscientists to equate whatever neural activity is measured with the experience, the mental experience, the spiritual experience. That simply cannot be. It's an almost basic philosophical error. So I do worry about that. And again, the same apparent neural data, i.e. Perhaps an EEG trace or an fMRI scan or evoked potentials, whatever it is, can be associated with very different experiences. So I think the mind has a kind of freedom of its own. I'm absolutely not a determinist. I don't see how any scientist can be a determinist after 100 years of physics explaining to us that nothing in the cosmos can ever be finally, certainly determined. But there we are.
Yes. Thank you, Ian. Thank you, David. We have a couple more questions. The next one will go to Lee. One second.
Hello, Lee.
Hello, Ian.
Hello.
It's the chance of a lifetime to speak with you. I've read your books for the last decade, and I feel like I'm a student of yours, and just being able to talk to you brings tears to my eyes. So, I'm a clinician. I deeply feel as though your medical, logical reasoning work created the vessel that allowed me to enter into that liminal space where I was able to then open up to include and transcend the scientific components of my training, and also go into the deeper, what I now recognize as the second half of my life, thanks to Richard Rohr. And I have over a dozen questions that I have ready and prompted, but I know that it wouldn't be just a one-on-one time with you today. So I had to pick one, and maybe a follow-up question if there's time. But when I looked at my questions, I saw that most of them were left hemisphere questions. They were specifics about things like the superior colliculus and the posterior cingulate and things that didn't really matter when I left this discussion with you. And so I had to pick one that if I didn't get the answer to it, I would regret it for the rest of my life. And so the question is, I found a video in which you briefly introduced a practice where you feel as though it's possible to, perhaps in a meditative or a prayerful state, exercise or develop the faculties of both hemispheres. And in that interview, unfortunately, the interviewer didn't dive further into that practice that you had mentioned. And centering prayer has become an incredibly important part of my path and my way. And I would love to know more about your practice and how you feel as though you're able to exercise the faculties of both hemispheres.
Well, I'm not sure I have an immediate formula, but what we do know is that in most types of meditation, the normal slight left preponderance over right in the EEG equalizes. And I think particularly in mindfulness, there's a passage in, I think it may be in the appendix to chapter 8.
I've lost audio, Ian.
23
We
Might-
lost,
respects,
Yeah.
23 respects in which it appears to be the nourishing of the of the right hemisphere. So I think that's part of it. And I think the other thing is that all that we know about spiritual wisdom is that it is not about knowing the facts. It is about unknowing and unlearning many of the things that got in the way of true perception of being. So I'm sorry, I have to cut it to that because we haven't got much time. Very disappointing answer. Sorry about that.
No, that's fine. And it actually, if I can be allowed, it brings me to that second follow-up question of that unknowing, which I would understand as the letting go of the left hemisphere towards the dominance of the right.
Yeah, and if I may, Lee, there's a few other questions. I know we're short on time, but I'm glad you were able to get a little bit of your question
Thank you,
answered.
Ian.
Yeah.
No, thank you, Lee.
All right, so we have a few more, and then we have to close, so we'll leave some time for that, and we want to be mindful of the time. So I think it was Randall was next.
Hi, Ian. I'm
Hi,
Randall.
Randall.
From Longmont, Colorado, and I know some of your friends in England who started the Dark Mountain Project.
Oh, yes, yes.
Which is, right now as Los Angeles has been burning and on fire, that this issue of climate change is the ever-present issue of our time. And, Paul Kingsnorth and Martin Shaw and some of those who began that project have left, as opposed to directly looking at this as an issue and seeing it as a spiritual issue. Paul Kingsnorth, of course, having a conversion experience and going Orthodox. And I just wanted to ask, how do you see that as, like, we have this rational problem, the planet is on fire. but how does the left and right hemisphere play in that as terms of a solution, and us as a society, how we deal with it?
Yes, good one. I mean, I think the problem is that thinking with the kind of left hemisphere thinking that got us into this situation, I'm paraphrasing Einstein here, will be no good at getting us out of it. And many of the problems we now face are the results of previous attempts to solve a problem in which we look too narrowly. So the left hemisphere has a very narrow focus, remember. It sees this problem as a separate problem. Whereas I think unless we see the connections between all these different problems and the root of them in something far profounder than any kind of fix, and I mean by that a spiritual renewal, picking up on something you were saying there. I mean, I sometimes say that it wouldn't be any good if we, by a miracle, were able to stop the destruction of forests and even reverse it and clear the poisoning of the seas and reverse that. And these are very, very important things for our survival, but our survival would be worth nothing because we'd still be these narrow-minded, selfish, narcissistic beings without any sense of the spiritual whole, of which it is, you know, our gift to be made part. So I that's what I feel. But in short, I think the problem is that we don't see farther enough ahead in time. We don't see the causes going back far enough in time, and we don't see the spill off at the sides of these things. So if we had thought grasslands burn, it's a natural thing for grasslands to burn, and indeed they can't thrive without burning. We wouldn't have thought we'll get a quick buck by building houses all over these grasslands, because sooner or later they're going to burn, you know? I mean, this is a replay of something that happened in the 19th century when people adopted a so-called rational way of forestry, in which they didn't leave enough fire breaks. And then when there was finally a fire, it destroyed the entire forest. So we haven't thought deeply, broadly, and contextually enough. We haven't thought with our whole being. That's my answer.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Randall. That was beautiful, and thanks for the response. Maybe just one or two more. I don't think we'll get to all the questions today, but Freya, I know Freya, you were here early too, so I'll add you now.
Yes, I was. Thank you so much.
Hello, Freya. Yes.
Hello. I'm thrilled. I know that for the sake of time, I have a long list of questions that I've wanted to ask you for over a decade as well, likely. Basically, I kind of want to know just how you personally sort of transform the realities in the world where leaders are lacking in wisdom, where we have people, either heads of family, heads of groups who are under the spell of Dunning-Kruger effect or narcissism or just a lack of wisdom, and they're operating, you know, with willful ignorance or something like that. How do you, with your enormous breadth of knowledge and natural leaning towards nuance and all of these beautiful things that we're all here for, how do you personally transform those kinds of observations or realities? What are some tools you use?
Oh, gosh, I wish I had the answer. I don't really know, because it's nothing that I do voluntarily or with effort. It's just, it's not a plan. It's not. That's why I'm always rather taken aback when people ask, so how do we do this and that and the other? Because I'm not really sure I have the answers to those. But what I do think is that if you start seeing the world differently, the ways of being and the ways of thinking come effortlessly. They come naturally. And that's what I would say was that at different stages in my life, I've been, I don't want to say anything that sounds pretentious, but I suppose I've been able to have a sort of moment of awakening of some kind. I don't consider myself a spiritually wise person or anything like that, but I am, you know, I've had these moments, and they've led me to ways of thinking and ways of being that issue in who I am. I'm a mystery to myself. I don't know the answer to this question. I'm really, really sorry. So what I wanted to say actually to everybody, just in a very quick moment, is if you happen to be members of Channel McGilchrist, and this is not a recruiting drive, but if you are, there's an occasion every 3 months where I spend a couple of hours doing a question and answer session, and you can put in a question and I will answer it. So there we are. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I have much more time to answer questions. I can answer a question
Yes.
for 10 minutes or something. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think maybe we'll transition now with Freya's question. And because Ian, it's a good segue into the resource page that we've created.
Okay.
And we want to get to
Okay.
the closing too, and we want to honor the memory of Martin Luther King. So I want to set some time away for that. So
Okay.
unfortunately, I do apologize. We won't get to all the questions today, but Ian, thank you for spending the time to answer a few questions.
You're very welcome, and thank you for including me.
All right, so I'll remove the spotlight. So let me share. We will send this out with the recording. 1 second. Just want to make sure what happened to it. Oh yeah, here it is, Ian. So there'll be this link for the resources. Channel McGilchrist, this is the image that the Channel McGilchrist uses. We'll put the prompts in here. A little article about the 4 people the Pope in 2015 talked about Americans following. A little bit about the sculpture that we were looking at, and we're going to use that in the closing. I know, Ian, we didn't start with all the accolades. I figured you hear that every time these things start. But my son was very impressed. He said, Dad, he's got a wiki page. So we have your Wikipedia page there. We have
It's not a
Ian's.
very good page, actually, but there we go.
All right. And, Ian, Richard also has 2 books, like a brain. We call them Wild Man to Wise Man and Adam's Return. They're not as
Right.
they're not as heavy in weight, but when a man asks us where to start, we have
Yes.
those 2 books, and their links to them are
Yes.
here. Robert
Right.
Moore, King, Warrior, Magician, Lover. We have a link to that. Somebody asked about the Everlasting Stream. There's a link to that in there. And then there's a collection of videos. It's easy to find Ian's videos. You just search on his name. Robert Moore gave a talk on, this was a retreat he did for 2 days. It's 6 hours, where he talks about the initiation rite and how that's so important in the culture and how it's missing. If you want to listen to that, it's available. When I first learned about the hemisphere imbalance, I was teaching CCD. I taught CCD for 20 years. And I used this video that Jill Bolte did. And I think you've mentioned that on this divided brain video that was done when you were starting.
Okay.
One of the brothers shared Sharon Blackley as somebody to connect with your right brain, so to speak. A local boy here who was inducted to the UK Hall of Fame talks about a band and how the whole is greater than the parts. We sent that
Yes.
around as a preview. The communities of practice, Channel McGilchrist. Ian, you mentioned that already.
Yes.
Is there anything else you'd like to say about that, or as a
Well, just that Channel McGilchrist, I invite you to go to anyway, because there's 80% of it is entirely free. All you have to do is click on it and enter, and there's a wealth of material there. But if you want to go deeper into things and speak to others in the community and join these Q&A sessions that I do, then by all means become a member.
All right. Thank you, Ian. And we encourage everyone to do that. And it's like I said in the beginning, I do feel like these 2 communities now have an association, affiliation, or maybe a partnership as we go forward. Richard's organization, Center for Action and Contemplation, if you want to learn more about that, illumin.org, which is the Illumin that's the organization that's hosting this. And if there's a contact from the UK, if you want to talk to somebody in your own time zone. And this was the first video, which was, I think, at a pub somewhere in London in 2023, or some kind of restaurant that started me down my journey with your work, Ian. It was very informative back then. So I'll stop the screen share as we start winding down. Yeah,
May I just add one thing?
sure.
If people really want the most condensed introduction to my work that there is, it's a 10-minute cartoon by the RSA, the Royal Society of Arts in London, based on a talk I gave there just after the launch of The Master and His Emissary. And when people say, how can I get a hold on what you're saying in the shortest possible time, that's the best way to spend 10 minutes. It's called the RSA Animate. So if you just Google McGilchrist RSA Animate. Yeah.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. And we'll put that in the on the page, Ian, and also when we send out the email after the event. So I wanted to start going into the close. There's three parts. There's the MLK part. You mentioned Albert Einstein. We have a piece from Albert Einstein that will bring about 20 voices together in to read. And then we'll have the Sanctus, the Gregorian Chant to close with. So there's three parts to it. Let me share my screen to get this first part going. 1 second. All right. This is the book. When I visited the museum where he was shot, they've turned it into the museum, the hotel. From the outside, it looks like the hotel, but in the inside, it's a beautiful museum. And there was a picture there of his briefcase that he had on his bed when he was shot and he died. And that book was in the briefcase, and so I purchased it. So this is from page 116. And I think you'll get a sense of the sacred in these words. After a particular strenuous day, I settled in bed at a late hour. My wife had already fallen asleep, and I was about to doze off when the telephone rang. An angry voice said, "Listen, nigger, we've taken all we want from you. Before next week, you'll be sorry you ever came into Montgomery." I hung up, but I could not sleep. It seemed that all my fears had come down on me at once. I had reached the saturation point. I got out of bed and began to walk the floor. Finally, I went to the kitchen and heated a pot of coffee. I was ready to give up. I tried to think of a way to move out of the picture without appearing to be a coward. In this state of exhaustion, when my courage had almost gone, I determined to take my problem to God. My head in my hands, I bowed over the kitchen table and prayed out loud. The words I spoke to God that midnight are still vivid in my memory. I am here taking a stand for what I believe is right. But now I'm afraid. The people are looking to me for leadership. And if I stand before them without strength and courage, they too will falter. I am at the end of my powers. I have nothing left. I've come to the point where I can't face it alone. At the moment, I experienced the presence of the divine as I had never been experienced him before. It seemed as though I could hear the quiet assurance of an inner voice saying, "Stand up for righteousness. Stand up for truth. God will be at your side forever." Almost at once, my fears began to pass. My uncertainty disappeared. I was ready to face anything. The outer situation remained the same, but God had given me inner calm. 3 nights later, our home was bombed. Strangely enough, I accepted the word of the bombing calmly. My experience that night with God had given me a new strength and trust. I knew now that God is able to give us the inner resources to face the storms and problems of our life. So thank you for listening to that. The next part we're going to need some help with. This is the second part of the closing. So we're going to use Albert Einstein's words. We'll give him the last word. Let me just move this over. So the way we do this is whoever wants to let the silence be our prompt. If you want, just read what's here, one line at a time, we'll try to get as many voices as we can into this part, into this piece. Whoever'd like to start, if you happen to talk over each other, one voice will take the part. So who'd like to get us started?
A human being is a part of the
whole
whole called by us
called by us
universe.
universe.
Not limited in time and space.
He experiences himself, his thoughts and feeling as something separated from the rest.
From the rest.
Kind of optical delusion of his
Delusion
consciousness.
of his consciousness.
This delusion is a kind of prison.
Prison for us, restricting us to our personal desires.
And to affection for a few persons nearest to us.
Our
Task
task
must be to
is
free
free
ourselves
from this
from this prison. Widening our circle of compassion.
Embrace all living creatures.
And the
whole
of nature in its beauty.
In its beauty.
Yes, so thank you. I often think of Albert Einstein. He came to Princeton, which is just a short distance from where I live, during the German Nazi occupation. Every time I drive through Princeton, I always think of him. So this last piece, and it's always bittersweet when we get to these points, and we'd love to spend more time with you, Iain, but we thank you for your presence and your willingness to spend the time with us. So I know you like music, and I know you talk about music quite a bit, and you mentioned it today. So I wanted to end this offering with music, and I wasn't sure what to use, and I thought, what would I want to share with Iain? And the Gregorian Chant came to me. I always thought it was a heavenly set of music that just takes me to someplace outside, puts me right into my right brain. So I happened to find this piece looking through some Gregorian chants, and it's called Sanctus. And in English, it would be holy. And to follow what we had done earlier, there's 3 parts to it. The chant takes about 1 minute, and it'll be repeated 3 times. So just kind of remember that flow that we did with our hands, right, left, right. You might want to use your hands as you're listening to the piece. It'll take about 3 minutes, and then we'll come back. So we'll just go over a little bit, if that's okay. Just give me a second to tee it up. And just want to make sure you can hear it. If somebody could let me know. Takes a second. wanted to mention from page 1289 in The Matter with Things, it says music is like a ladder of tears on which our belongings for God ascend. And hopefully you felt some of that in that piece. So we've come to the end of our
Indeed.
time.
Was it the monks of the Abbey of Solesmes in France? It sounds like them.
Maybe you know what, Ian, I'll find out and I'll let you know.
Yeah. I when I was at Oxford, I was a member of the Oxford University Gregorian Chant Society. So,
so
it's very close to my heart. So there you go. Thank you for that.
Yes. Thank you, Ian. And so thank you, Ian and Mary. Mary was the one who, Ian, I have to tell you, I sent the email to you asking for this, and there was an immediate reply that said, I'm busy. I got some other things to do. And when I asked Richard, the same thing happened. But I thought, you know what? I tried. And then a few weeks later, I happened to be out on my sailboat watching the sun come up on a July morning. I'll never forget that morning. I always like to check my email, not my social media. But that morning, Mary's email came in, and she had said that you accepted our offer. And I just remember looking up to the heavens and smiling. So I thought we'd circle back, right, Ian? You always talk about spirals and circles. And I thought,
yes.
I really feel the hemisphere hypothesis is the lock. The loss of initiation is the key. So I'll close with these words from The Matter with Things. From Ludwig Wittgenstein. Yes, a key can lie forever in the place where the locksmith left it and never be used to open the lock the master forged it for. Our hope and my hope is, Ian, you'll help us unlock the lock. Together we can do that. I hope our communities, it's the beginning of a partnership where we see both our visions together as one. So thank you, Ian.
Thank you very much, Anthony.
Yes. Blessings on your evening and your dreams tonight. We always like to say, for everybody else, if you'd like to stay, we'll take a 5-minute break, and then we'll have a little after chat with some small breakouts for 15 minutes. And if you want to connect with Illumin, if you go to the website, there's tons of links there. So maybe as parting, if you want to put your parting messages to Ian in the chat, that might be nice.
Yes. Could you save the chat and then I can read it later?
Okay. Yes.
If you don't save it, it gets lost. So
okay.
I would like to see, But okay. I will leave you now. So thank you very much and bye-bye.
Yes. Thanks, Ian. Peace.
Thank you.